So we finally arrived at the pinnacle of the argument in the way that I've structured it, which is the general law of capital accumulation. And by the end of these last set of videos, there's actually going to be one kind of epilogue video right afterwards in which I talk about the transformation problem. But by the end of this set of videos on the general law of capital accumulation, it's my hope that that people will feel like we've kind of synthesized everything together that we've said throughout this whole series and have a general picture in our heads of what the capitalist system is really all about. The general law of capital accumulation is the punchline to volume 1, and the reason that I'm getting to it last is because one, I think that it's helpful to have everything else, up to that point, but also because it's such an impactful punchline that everything else kind of seems almost like dull in comparison. And so I wanted to have it last so as not to kind of undermine all of the other, as I think you'll agree, like very interesting and important points that are made after that. So I kind of like the way I've structured this argument, and so let's get started. So I want to open up with a question that I'm going to kind of leave unanswered that I'd like to kind of keep in the back of people's minds throughout this video, which is the question of what is a free market? Now, I'm not going to define free market in any rigorous way, but I am going to kind of point out what I think is self-evidently a precondition for anything calling itself a free market, which is that at the very least, a free market should have the property that the people bringing a commodity to the market for trade has control over the price of that commodity, at least primary control over the price of that commodity, in the sense that they control the supply and demand of that product, at least collectively. If I look at like the bread industry as a whole, all of the capitalists making bread, all the capitalists that have bread that are taking the bread to market, they are the ones who, control the supply and demand of that commodity. They can produce more of it if they want. They can produce less of it than they want. They can demand whatever they want for it. And at the end of the day, they make the rules when it comes to the price of bread. At the very least, anything calling itself a free market should have that property. So if there's a particular commodity for which this doesn't apply, for which this kind of precondition for a free market economy doesn't apply to it, then you wouldn't have a truly free market under capitalism. And so the commodity that I'd like to think about in particular is labor power. Labor power is a commodity that is produced and at least nominally owned by the workers themselves. The workers reproduce their labor power in the domestic economy. They go home and they reproduce themselves, and then they bring themselves to market to sell their labor power. They are the producers, they are the owners of that commodity. And so the collective worker here should have control in the same way as the other stuff over the supply and demand of their labor power. They should be able to have control how much there is, and also in virtue of that be able to control what they demand for it. So a question that I would like to kind of have in the back of people's minds throughout this video is who actually controls the supply and demand of labor? So let's really get started now. We are going to continue to talk about what we've been talking about, which is accumulation. But we're going to back up and we're going to think about it a little more qualitatively than we've been thinking about it. So the individual capitalist has 3 methods of accumulation available to them. The first method is simple accumulation. And so what I'm calling simple accumulation is kind of the simple scaling up of production using whatever the current methods are. So there's a bundle of commodities and a certain kind of style of organization that is used to make any one commodity. The capitalist making a certain thing goes into market and they buy a collection of raw materials and means of production, and they buy a certain amount of labor power, and then they make the thing. And so what simple accumulation is when you take the surplus from doing that process and you simply do more of that exact same process. You just simply get more of that same means of production, more of that same labor power in the same proportions, and you continue to do what you're doing, just more of it. That's kind of the simplest kind of accumulation. The second kind of accumulation is when you change the method of production. You implement new technologies, you restructure how you're organizing people, you do something and you change the way in which the thing is made a bit. And if you implement, like, let's say, labor-saving technology, then we've seen that this can produce, temporary super profits for the capitalists, which can be reinvested to accumulate more. And so, this is in that sense kind of a method of accumulation. So that's that's another thing that's available to the capitalists that they can do with their surplus that's separate from simple accumulation. And then the third thing they can do is they can centralize. Centralization is the third thing. Buy out your competitors, mergers and acquisitions, right? Control your whole industry, create a syndicate maybe. build an empire. And we've mentioned that centralization, unlike these other two, from the standpoint of society as a whole, is not accumulation at all. You're just kind of rearranging the capital that's already there and moving it around. But from the perspective of an individual capitalist, is absolutely a form of accumulation. An individual capitalist, if they buy out someone else's capital, then they have increased their total capital. They've accumulated capital at that point. And so these are kind of like the three categories that we're going to be thinking about as we go. Now, before we kind of move on, I want to point out that 2 and 3 here are not entirely separate. And the reason for that is that you're generally not going to get this accumulation of this third type without also getting something of type 2. Because when you centralize a bunch of capital, then that creates opportunities for changes in the organization that didn't exist before. We mentioned this in the 4th video that the bigger capitals have sort of a competitive advantage over the smaller capitals just by virtue of their size, right? They can just do things that the smaller capitals can't. So accumulation of type 3 doesn't generally come without some accumulation of type 2, and usually quite a bit of it at that. And then there's another qualitative difference between 1 and then these two together, which is that we can expect that simple accumulation is basically always going on. Like that every production period, you have some simple accumulation going on at kind of a steady rate. Whereas these two types of accumulation are going to occur in fits and starts, as Marx would say. They're going to occur, sporadically, all at once, right? All at once you get a giant, buyout that leads to something crazy being implemented. All at once you have kind of new technologies being implemented. Obviously, that's not going to be constantly happening. New technologies are invented whenever they're invented. So that's a qualitative difference that's of some importance, which is that 1 is something that we can kind of think of as always happening, kind of on some level, and then 2 and 3 happen in fits and starts. So to keep things simple at first, we're going to kind of focus on accumulation of type 1 without any worry about types 2 or 3 happenings. So if simple accumulation is the only thing that's going on, then the capitalists are consistently taking portions of their surplus, bringing them to market, and expanding their production by buying new means of production, like more of it, and new labor power, like more of it. In other words, they have to go out and they have to buy a certain amount more labor than they already had. In other words, and this is kind of an obvious thing, like given kind of something like a labor theory of value, but it's extremely important to point out, which is that the accumulation to capital, to this extent, is 1-to-1 with a growing workforce. Accumulation of capital, to the extent that it's just this kind of accumulation, is increase in the proletariat. You cannot accumulate without hiring more workers if this is all you're doing. And we'll show actually mathematically that these rates are identical. The rate of accumulation and the rate of increase in the proletariat are identical if this is all that's happening. We'll show that in a bit. And this begs the question, where do these new workers come from? There had to be workers available to hire already. And so what we're observing here is kind of sinister, which is that in order for capitalism to continually exist, it has to continually maintain a labor market. In other words, it has to continually maintain a mass of dispossessed people who have no means of production of their own, who have no way to subsist other than going into the market and selling their labor power, who can't find work. That they're not only dispossessed, but they are unable to find someone to buy their labor power, because otherwise they wouldn't be available to hire later. So you have to maintain a desperate portion of the population, and it gets even more sinister when you think about things like the rate of exploitation. You have to have them desperate enough that the rate of exploitation is high enough, sufficient kind of rate of reinvestment is happening. We tend to kind of almost accept at this point, without really thinking about it, the existence of the continual existence of an unemployed portion of the population. We just kind of think, oh yeah, 2% unemployment, 5% unemployment. You're just going to have that in capitalism. But that's kind of messed up when you think about it. That means that there's a section of the population that is seeking work that cannot find work at all times. And that's necessary for capitalism to function, because capitalism requires accumulation to function, which requires you to hire more workers. And so that portion of the population must exist at all times, and it must be maintained at all times. And so we're going to call this mass of dispossessed people who are seeking work and creating the labor market. To say that there is a labor market is to say that there is a portion of the population that is unemployed and seeking employment. We're going to call this the Industrial Reserve Army of Labor, or more simply, we're just going to call it the Reserve Army. And we should note immediately that we are not simply calling it the unemployed population. And the reason for that is because the reserve army encompasses a lot more than just the unemployed population, especially the way that we typically take that statistic. But before we get into the composition of the reserve army and who's in it and what kinds of groups exist within it, let's kind of talk about it broadly and talk about the effect that it has on the actual laboring population. The effect that it has is essentially pressure. There's a tendency among like the better paid jobs in capitalism to dismiss the plight of certain other groups. They might kind of look at, you know, the homeless problem or the problem of the treatment of immigrants, and they might say to themselves, that's not my problem. And this couldn't be further from the truth. And it's kind of amazing that they managed to convince themselves of that, because it's very simple why that couldn't be further from the truth. The reason is that the bigger the reserve army, the lower their wages are going to be, the worse they're going to be treated. And the reason for that is that the bigger the reserve army is, the more replaceable you are if you're somebody that actually has a job. And the more replaceable that you are, the more replaceable that a laborer is, the less bargaining power they have. And if they don't have bargaining power, then they're not going to be able to negotiate their wages very high. They, you know, if there's 30% unemployment in my country, and my boss comes out and says to everybody that they're going to have to start volunteering twice a week for like 16-hour shifts, then I'm going to be a lot more inclined to say yes, sir, to that than if there was only like 1% unemployed. And it's not just a matter of the size of the reserve army either. The quality of the treatment of these other groups also has a direct bearing on the position that I'm in to bargain. Right? If I want better treatment in some way, or if I don't want worse treatment, then I better be looking at these other groups and looking at how they're treated, because if they're treated worse, then you know it's going to look more normal for me to be treated worse, right? So you know the position, the quality of life of the reserve army and the size of it has a direct bearing on the situation for the working class generally. So Marx breaks the reserve army down into three groups, and then he makes a fourth group up. Which is a little different than the other three, but is directly related. So the three groups that he starts with are what he calls the floating population, the latent population, and the stagnant population. And then he introduces this pauper population, but we'll get into that eventually. So the floating population is the unemployed population proper, as you know it. These are the people who have, for reasons we'll get into, been let go from some previous employment and are in the process of seeking new employment somewhere else. You know, when you hear an unemployment statistic, you're really getting a sense of the floating population, as Marx would describe it. It's pretty self-explanatory. The latent population is a little more interesting. The latent population is basically, these are pools of potential workers. I.e., these are populations which have not yet been fully integrated into capitalist production, but are either in the process of being integrated in, or are vulnerable to being integrated in. And historically, it can be different. The groups that are part of the latent population are different depending on the time period. So in Marx's time period, he was principally concerned with the peasants, the agricultural peasants that were being kind of thrown off the land by the big landowners, and basically dispossessed of their means of subsistence that way. And so, you know, the agricultural population was the original kind of latent population that was converted into wage laborers by being proletarianized, by being dispossessed of their property and having no choice but to kind of wander into the cities and offer their labor to people. So that's a latent population. Children are another kind of classic latent population, depending on the time period. Women are also one. You know, in the 60s or the late 60s, in the beginning of neoliberalism, most women in the United States were housewives, until it got to the point where you couldn't really support a family on one paycheck anymore, and so women found themselves kind of being thrown out of the domestic economy, maybe more accurately, forced out of the domestic economy, forced to basically enter the workforce and look for jobs to support their families. And so, you know, women were an important kind of latent population of the reserve army, you know, in the beginning of neoliberalism. Other modern examples include the prison population. We have a gigantic prison population. I think it's only a matter of time before politicians start to talk about mobilizing that prison population for more conventional work, and so forth, right? Patreon artisans is another one I added. I don't really mean just Patreon, by the way. You know, I would also include, like, you know, Etsy creators, you know, Twitch streamers, YouTubers. You know, there's kind of a budding sort of neo-artisan class that's sort of forming right now. And just kind of like the small business owners, the petty bourgeoisie, this group is in perpetual danger of ruin and falling into the proletariat, and in that sense they are sort of a minor latent population. They're never going to be like a big one. There's, in general, historically, there's always a particular latent population that the capitalist class is sort of eyeing. We'll get into that more when we talk more about the latent population on its own. And then finally we have the stagnant population, which actually is technically employed. They're part of the reserve army, but they are kind of technically employed, but this employment is very tenuous, it's very precarious, it's very irregular. Jobs that kind of might be classified as barely jobs, or jobs that nobody wants, jobs that like are very hard to survive on their own, are the stagnant population. Basically, the way you should think about the stagnant population as part of the reserve army is that these are people that, despite having jobs, would be very receptive to being offered anything better than what they already have. People, sometimes you hear the word precariat being thrown around to describe this group. We'll talk more about them in a bit as well. And then finally, you have people that have sort of fallen out of the workforce entirely. And so these people are people who have fallen out of the workforce for whatever reason. We're going to talk a lot more about them. But Marx refers to this population as the population of paupers. And each of these groups has kind of unique functions and properties within the system. And by looking at all of them one at a time, we're going to get a kind of sense of what the reserve army is all about, and kind of color it in, so to speak. And by the way, this last sentence I should have deleted. You know, this army as a whole has an important qualitative effect. That's what we already said. That's the effect on the bigger it is and the worse off it is, the worse off the laboring population is generally. So now let's kind of zoom in on these populations one at a time. So first off, let's look at the floating population. And what's immediately noteworthy is that there are some advantages to having a large floating population over the other types. And the reason is very simple, which is that the floating population have been employed already, and so they have they tend to have more skills, they tend to have better education, they tend to be already kind of disciplined, not disciplined in like, that is to say they've already been kind of domesticated as a labor force. What I mean by disciplined? They require less training in general, and so that's an advantage to the floating population. It also makes the floating population kind of closer to the actual employed population. If you're thinking about who's in line to take your job, you're going to think first about this floating population here. However, kind of like the other side of the coin here is that because they are used to being a worker, they're also going to tend to be better organized than these other populations of the reserve army. They have a better understanding of what they're entitled to, so in that sense they're less easy to subdue, even though they're already kind of domesticated, like I said, as labor. And so for a capitalist system, then you had the floating population is a double-edged sword. It's desirable in the sense that they're already kind of conditioned as workers, but it's also, I say impossible to maintain. I should probably say very difficult. It's very difficult to maintain a very large floating population. The floating population is the most dangerous kind of population, and if we're thinking in terms of like revolutionary change and organized action to actually like, against the system at large. And this is why we have this notion of like an acceptable floating population, right? I mean, capitalists generally wants to have like, a 3% unemployed population. Not too big, not too small, it's like 2%, right? Capitalists they don't want the unemployed population to be zero, because then there's no available labor that's already kind of ready to work. But they don't want it too big either, because that's dangerous, or at least, the kind of capitalist thought process up to now is what I just said. Right? Obviously, you've got countries in Europe that are kind of soaring in unemployment. Last I checked, I think Greece has like 30% unemployment. So I mean, you have some insane numbers depending on the place, but generally you're going to see capitalists desiring to keep this number somewhat small. And the desire to keep this number somewhat small is exactly what necessitates a latent population. This is why we have more to the reserve army than just the floating. Capitalists always, they want to have like a nice pool of skilled workers to pull from, but they also are going to always have their eyes somewhere else, on some other group that could be turned into a cheap labor force, basically. And that brings us to the latent population. So again, just to kind of reiterate, when labor becomes too scarce or it becomes too powerful in a capitalist society proper, then the capitalists in that society are going to look elsewhere. Or inward. They might look inward at groups like women or children or prisoners, like I mentioned. if capital controls are tight and it's difficult to kind of offshore your industry just to a cheaper, to cheaper labor in other countries, then you might try to import labor from the less stable countries, right? There's historical examples of this, like Germany importing labor from Turkey, France importing labor from North Africa, and so forth. If that's not an option, if there's no countries that aren't in like dire straits to pull cheap labor from, that are desperate to leave their country, then why not just destabilize some other country and make it an option? So this is kind of the story of the Mexican peasants, the story of NAFTA. So the way this story goes is that once upon a time, there were a bunch of peasants in Mexico, like small peasants that had small plots of land that were able to make decent livings for themselves by farming produce and then bringing that produce to the Mexican markets and selling it to make a living. And they were able to do this because Mexico had strong tariff barriers that were keeping food prices high. But once NAFTA got negotiated and those tariff barriers fell, food prices plummeted because tons of cheap food started to make its way into Mexico. And so those peasants found themselves ruined. They could no longer live on their produce. And so they were just kind of driven off their land that way. And they all kind of just flooded the cities looking for cheap work. And when they couldn't find work in the cities, they started to kind of try to smuggle themselves across the border to the United States to find jobs somewhere else. And it's important. I think this really colors in what NAFTA is, right? This is an act of war on the global working class. It's an act of war on the global working class in the sense that it is, it is a violent dispossessing of a large peasant population to inflate the global reserve army. That's what NAFTA is. The capitalists will convince themselves of otherwise. We know that, but that's really what NAFTA was. I've been talking a lot in all these videos about kind of ideological implications of some of this stuff, and I think a very interesting one that you can kind of extrapolate from this theory of the reserve army is anti-immigrant sentiment from the working class. The working class is going, the working class of the country, neighboring Mexico, is going to look at these former peasants that are running across the border trying to find jobs, and they're going to kind of rightfully see that as a threat to themselves. Now, they're blaming the wrong group. You shouldn't be blaming the Mexican peasants. You should be blaming the people that dispossessed the Mexican peasants. But it's interesting because this anti-immigrant sentiment really is a product of capitalism. It's not a product of racism or anything else like that. It's just a product of the capitalist class waging war without calling it that on the working class generally. The same anti-immigrant sentiment emerged in France and Germany when they imported their labor too. It's a very common thing. And then if capital controls are loose, then the capitalists might simply take their accumulation somewhere else, for example, to the cheap labor force of China. The peasant population of China is really the latent population that saved capitalism up to, from 1970 up to now. Just a gigantic population of extremely cheap labor. I don't need to repeat the story. I think I've talked enough about it already in other videos. But in any case, maybe one of the morals of this story is that at any given moment, in any given country, you're generally going to be hearing about some population somewhere else which could be taking up the jobs of the proletariat that is in your country already. You're always going to be hearing about some population like that, and that is the latent population. Not every group that I've mentioned as part of the latent population is at any given moment part of the latent population. Who is in the latent population depends on what populations are in this discourse and in this process of being proletarianized at any given moment. But the fear-mongering of this group of these particular groups to come take your job makes you feel more replaceable, and thus lowers your bargaining power. And so this is not just a way to lower the means of subsistence and lower the quality of life of workers in general. It's also a method of divide and conquer. And that's where this anti-immigrant sentiment comes from. This is a way to turn the lower classes against each other and away from the capitalists that are waging this war. And so there's another extremely important, I think, moral to the story of this theory of the reserve army, and in particular the latent population part, is that this really is proof that since capitalism is a global system, there really is no such thing as a national proletariat. There is only an international proletariat. There is only one workforce on Earth, because the well-being of any one worker anywhere in the world is dependent on the well-being of every other worker everywhere else in the world. The worse off somebody is anywhere, the worse off you are. The white-collar programmer with their cushy desk job in the United States might not want to admit that the borderline slave labor of workers in Qatar is directly tied up with their class interests, but they're fooling themselves if they think otherwise. And any socialist that thinks that a working class movement can be only national and not international is also fooling themselves. The world we're in is obviously very complicated, but on some level, on this basic level, you have to admit that the class interests of the global proletariat are aligned against the global capitalist class. In fact, you could almost go further than that and say that the class interests of everybody that's not a capitalist are aligned against the capitalist class in this way. You cannot address the poverty of one country without addressing the poverty everywhere else. You just can't. This is all bound up. I think that's kind of one thing that we should take away from this discussion. So the next layer of the Industrial Reserve Army to talk about is the stagnant population. Marx later refers to this group, I think, as like the Lazarus layers of the working class. These workers tend to have jobs. They have things that they can do to get paid, but they are typically not viewed as things that you would either want to do long term because it's like dangerous to your health, or things that you can use to supplement your income, but are generally not viable as like full means of employment. That's why I have Uber here. Uber is a classic example right now of maybe not classic. Uber is like a modern example right now of a job that, a lot of people do it to like get some extra money every now and then, but the people that are trying to make a living off of Uber are going to be having an extremely hard time. Depending on where you are, it can be almost impossible. So these are kind of odd jobs that people pick up, during a crisis. They're jobs that people pick up to supplement their income. They're not easy jobs to live on. Things like that. If you're in that group, then you're in the stagnant population. You're sort of one foot out the door, I guess, as a worker. You have a job, but it's really precarious. That's the stagnant population. This picture here is one of these kinds of jobs that Marx was talking about. That these women are picking oakum, which means that they're taking like old ropes from ships and stuff and kind of unwinding them with their hands. Just like takes forever just to make this kind of stuffing thing that you can use to seal gaps. And they get paid like pennies for it. And it's something that basically like the parishes that were sort of acting as the welfare state at the time, we're basically giving this as a job to people that couldn't do more manual labor, just to kind of give them something to do almost out of pity. Like the payment you get for something like this is just meager. But a lot of people did it when they got home just to kind of get by easier. So it's these kinds of jobs. Another maybe example of this stagnant population job increasingly is Amazon labor. Of course, Amazon labor varies highly depending on where you are. I actually have a neighbor that's an Amazon driver, and he seems to think that he gets off decently well, and he supports a family of 2 kids on it. So, I think it varies highly depending on where you are. But I also know that Amazon has some very let's just say, interesting strategies regarding its worker. They pride themselves on their quote-unquote high turnover rates. What that means is that they hire and let go of workers really, really fast, at a very high rate. Nobody stays working at Amazon for very long. In other words, they are trying explicitly not to be a job that you get and keep and make a living on. It's a job that, Amazon wants to be a job that you pick up when you're desperate and you don't stay in for a while, so they are trying to be like the job for this population, really. It's worth noting that living conditions for this group, and living conditions in general for kind of like the lowest segment of the worst paid jobs in a capitalist society, tend to historically almost always be worse than the treatment that you'll receive in prison. That's kind of almost been true for the entire history of capitalism, believe it or not. And this is why you've probably no doubt heard a story at some point in your life of an ex-convict being let out of prison and then just doing another crime to end up back in prison because they just feel like they're going to have an easier time there. And once we get to the pauper population, we'll say more about why that is the case. But that's the stagnant population. Also, one more kind of possible characterization of the jobs that would kind of put you in this population versus the other jobs that somebody mentioned that I thought was really interesting is they basically said to me, like, if the job that you're looking at doesn't require a background check, then it's part of this group. In other words, these are the jobs that are available to you if you're like if you have a criminal record, or if you're an illegal immigrant, which I thought is pretty interesting considering what else I just said. And so finally we get to the pauper population, which isn't really the reserve army. It's basically where you go when you fall out of even the reserve army. So to put it simply, this is the place where you're warned as a child that you're going to end up if you don't conform to what society demands of you. These are the people that society, for at some point in your life, points at and tells you don't want to be like them, so you better cooperate, right? So nowadays, I think the term pauper is generally translated to mean like extremely poor. But I think the historical definition is more valuable here. The historical definition of a pauper is one who kind of lives off of charity and public aid. And I think that's more accurate, in my opinion, for reasons we'll get to. Sometimes these people are referred to by Marxists as lumpen proletarians. Now, I personally think that from what I've read of Marx in his other works, and from what I've heard Marx writes in a lot of his letters for people that are doing a lot of research on this stuff, that Marx's notion of lumpenness is a separate concept from this pauper population. I don't think it's correct to view the pauper population as the lumpen proletariat and the lumpen proletariat as the pauper population. I suppose I can't just say that without kind of going on a small tangent and explaining what I think the word lumpen means. So let me do that real fast before I continue talking about paupers. I think that lumpenness as a concept is basically the negation of class consciousness. I think that the way I see it basically is that the amount of class consciousness you have is like a number between 0 and 1. And if the number is 1, then you're fully class conscious, and then if the number is 0, then you're fully lumpen. Basically what I mean by that is that if you're fully lumpen, then you feel no solidarity towards any class at all. You're entirely out for your own self-benefit. You're not class conscious at all in the sense that you feel you feel like your interests are not at all bound up with the interests of any other class. And so you can see from my definition that paupers are going to tend to be lumpenized, the lumpen proletariat. But Marx, uses the term lumpen to refer to other classes throughout all of his works. He refers to the finance aristocracy of France in 1848 as the lumpen proletariat ascended to the highest rungs of society. So you've got these finance capitalists that Marx is calling lumpen. He refers to Louis Napoleon as the king of the lumpens, basically. And I think, to some extent, I think that all of us are to some extent lumpen today, in the sense that the signal of class consciousness has been sort of damped by our kind of mutual isolation from one another. I think this is also why a lot of people saw Trump as a relatable figure, because Trump is a very lumpenized billionaire. He's very much he's kind of clueless about the actual interests of the capitalist class. I think Trump kind of outwardly demonstrates a high degree of lumpen self-interest, and I think that a lot of more discouraged and more socially isolated people in this country saw that as actually relatable. And I think that this is kind of where the notion of an honor among thieves come from. There is sort of an anti-solidarity that forms here. If you're totally lumpen, then you feel almost sort of like an attachment to other people like you, because you can relate to them, and sort of there's kind of an you see what I mean there. But anyway, that's what I think lumpen means. And so I'm not going to claim that my definition of lumpenness is correct. I would advocate for it because I think it's a useful category. But you can see that given my definition, given how I think about that category, that it's very likely that a pauper, someone who's fallen into this pauper population, is very likely to be lumpen. They very likely have stopped thinking about themselves as a worker long ago. But they might not. They might still consider themselves to be a part of the proletariat. It's really kind of up to them. But in any case, the people who have become kind of too demoralized, too physically broken, these people to continue working, to continue kind of seeking employment in the workforce, they become pauperized. And Marx actually breaks this population down into 3 subgroups itself. These groups I don't think are nearly as important as the 3 segments of the reserve army, but let's go over them quickly anyway. And so the breakdown is basically 1, the people who are able to work, but instead of working, they get by some other means, semi-legal or kind of illegal shenanigans, right? Petty crime, scavenging, and so forth. Category 2, he just kind of refers to as category 2, he just says orphans are the other category. I think, we don't really leave orphans on the street begging anymore, at least in most, developed capitalist countries. So, maybe this category is a little outdated. I'm not sure. You can tell me what you think in the comments. And then this third group I think is the most important, at least in our day and age. And I actually quote Marx here because I want to make sure that I'm not like deforming the story into my own version of things. He calls them the demoralized and ragged, and those unable to work, chiefly people who succumb to their incapacity for adaptation due to the division of labor, people who have passed the normal age of the laborer, the victims of industry whose number increases with the increase of dangerous machinery, and then he goes on about what kinds of horrible workplace accidents can occur. I think that this category includes a lot of people that we think about a lot today, such as people like NEETs, not in education, employment, or training. These people that kind of, this hikikomori group in Japan that kind of lives in the attic of their parents and just kind of lives off whatever their parents let them have because they just feel just too demoralized to enter the workforce. It just seems too miserable to them. They're just not even going to do it. I think that group very much belongs in this population. Elderly people, Marx said so himself, disabled people, people who live on welfare because they've lost an arm or something, things like that. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that in our modern era, there's a lot more ways to kind of end up falling out of the workforce and the reserve army and subsisting anyway than there used to be in Marx's time. And so I think there's a lot more kind of going on in this third category than there used to be. So that's the pauper population. Now it's important that we understand where this population kind of lies in the overall theory of capitalism that Marx is creating here. What's important about this the most important thing to note about this pauper population is that it is a social necessity to exist, because as long as the reserve army is necessary, which we've said that it is, you cannot have capitalism without a reserve army. A part of that reserve army will constantly be falling into pauperism. They're constantly going to be falling into this pool of misery. And it's important to understand that as long as capitalism exists, you're going to have this pauper population. And so this pauper population is socially necessary in capitalism. And if it turns out that the reserve army, let's say, grows over time, well, then this pauper population would naturally also grow over time. This kind of pooling of misery would just get worse and worse as time went on. Now, since pauperism is a social necessity, a capitalist system has to accommodate this group in some way. They have to keep this group somewhat alive with welfare programs, which will vary in quality depending on how powerful the working class is. But if the capitalist class is the one in power, then these welfare programs are going to be as minimal as possible, because it's in the interest of the capitalist class to implement welfare programs that are sufficiently vicious to where nobody wants to fall into this class. Because remember the very first thing I said about this group. I shouldn't have called it a class. Remember what I said first about this group, which is that these are the people that your mom or dad will point to and be like, if you don't cooperate, you're going to turn into this. If the thing they're pointing at doesn't look that bad, then you're not going to have a viable workforce. So the existence of paupers, the continued existence of this group are like a threat. And sometimes you need to just make them more miserable to kind of whip the working class into shape a little bit. And this is exactly what we saw during neoliberalism. You saw the Reagan assault on the welfare state. He created this kind of nonsense idea of like somebody that's just kind of the welfare queen, and then just decided to just kind of wage a general assault on all of these people and just make their lives significantly worse. And that was part of the general campaign to weaken the power of the working class. Because by making the paupers more miserable, you are lowering the baseline of misery in your country. That's what you're doing. And so that's the significance of a pauper population within a Marxist theory. It establishes sort of like a baseline misery index. So now that we've got a decent picture in our heads about what the reserve army is and who's in it and what it's about, we're now going to finally turn to the question of what is going to happen to it. What are the dynamics of the reserve army? Basically, we're going to ask the question, what is going to happen to the reserve army in a healthy capitalist system? Now, in order to discuss dynamics, you have to specify initial conditions. We've been talking a lot about accumulation as a process that's going to be happening, but we haven't really said, take a capitalist society, start it out, just like, press go, see what happens to it. If you want to do that, then you have to kind of specify what your initial society looks like. And an observation that you have to make is that if you initialize a capitalist system and there's no labor market, then no accumulation is going to occur, because as we said, accumulation of capital is increase in the proletariat. You can't hire, if there's no workers to hire, then you can't accumulate. And so when we initialize our capitalist system, we have to already have a labor market. In other words, in order to even begin talking about our theoretical capitalism, we have to already have a sufficiently miserable reserve army. Or equivalently, we have to begin with a society in which some people have capital, which is the same. It's the same statement. To have capital is to have command over labor, over people's labor that you can exploit, that you can potentially profit from. So we have to have these things already in place, and so that's an extremely interesting thing to note, is that you can't even think about a theoretical capitalism from the start, unless you already have an extremely unequal society that's somehow become unequal prior to capitalism. You have to have had some kind of accumulation happen in a few hands. You have to have capital accumulate in a few hands, or equivalently, you have to have a labor market come into existence. You have to have a bunch of dispossessed people that are kind of knocking door to door looking for work. You have to have that situation already in order to even begin thinking about the dynamics of capitalism. And so that's what we're going to have to assume. We're going to have to assume that we initially have a big reserve army. So how did we get here? Let's think, before we start to deal with it, let's think about how did we get here? And the answer is robbery, war, and historical context, right? There has to have been some accumulation of capital prior to capitalism's development. And Marx calls this original accumulation. He calls this primitive accumulation. In fact, I'd like to actually read a couple of quotes from Marx in Capital about this. I'm going to be reading quotes from Marx more often in these next few videos. So early on in the book, in chapter 6, he says this: "The question why this free labor confronts him in the market has no interest for the owner of money, who regards the labor market as a branch of the general market for commodities. And for the present, it interests us just as little. We cling to the fact theoretically, as he does practically. One thing, however, is clear. Nature does not produce on the one side owners of money or commodities, and on the other men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no natural basis. Neither is its social basis one that is common to all historical periods. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production." And then later on, when he's actually looking at primitive accumulation in the final section of the book, he says, "The process, therefore, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possession of his means of production. A process that transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producers into wage laborers. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it." So every society is going to have its own history of primitive accumulation. It's going to be a different story for every society. The common thread is going to be basically that at some point, a large number of people are dispossessed of the means of production, and conversely, a group of people comes into possession of those means of production. It's always going to be like that. It's a different story for every country, but it's always that. The version of this story that Marx studies and talks about is the case of Britain, obviously. This picture here is a bunch of fences that were put up during a period known as the enclosure of the Commons. Basically, what you had happen in Britain is you had a market for wool, which was exploding. And during this period of time, the lords of the manors decided to kind of put up these fences and tell the peasants that would normally live there and get taxed for their produce and all of that, that they're not allowed to be here anymore because we need this land for sheep to graze. And you don't really need that many people working the land if that's all you're doing with it. And so these peasants got kicked off the land, and simultaneously land became a commodity at that point too. Labor and land became a commodity simultaneously. That's going to be a thing, by the way, that's missing from these videos, is an analysis of land rent and the conversion of feudal land ownership to commodity land ownership, land as commodity. But basically land started getting valued at that point by basically how many sheep could be grazing there. They started to kind of estimate that, and then based on that figure out how much land was worth, and then land became a commodity at the exact same time as labor became a commodity. But labor was becoming a commodity because these peasants were being kicked off the land, so that the people who technically owned the land in the feudal sense, could graze their sheep. And so this was a long, very violent process with a lot of different events and historical things that happened during it. And Marx writes a lot about it, and there's a lot you can read about it elsewhere. So I'm not going to get into it, but this is a very specific story to Britain, as you can see, and there's a different story everywhere else. And in some places, primitive accumulation is an ongoing process. In fact, there's certain Marxists that argue that you can't have capitalist accumulation without having something like primitive accumulation going on somewhere else at the same time. And so there's a whole body of theory here and stuff. But in any case, we're just going to assume that we have this process has ended and we have a big reserve army. Primitive accumulation has happened, and we're going to start our capitalist system off under the assumption that it's happened and we have a big reserve army. So as we said, we're going to start out with a fixed initial, pretty decently big reserve army, and along with that, a pretty decently high initial rate of exploitation. We're going to assume something a little peculiar in order to kind of see some properties of capitalism more clearly. And we're going to have to remove those assumptions later and think about the effect that that's going to have on the results that we get with those assumptions. But for now, what we're going to assume is that everything happens perfectly in circulation. We're not going to worry about circulation at all. What we mean by this is that we're basically going to dismiss everything we considered in the previous video for now. We'll bring it back up later. We'll bring it back into the picture afterwards. But just for the sake of seeing something completely separate, we're just going to kind of throw that aside for the time being. So now what we really mean by this is a little vague to just say everything works perfectly in circulation. What we really mean is that any capitalist, regardless of what they decide to do with their profits, is always going to find exactly what they want to purchase in the market, even if nobody made it, and that they're always going to find a customer to buy anything they produce, even if no such person exists. So basically, any commodity that a capitalist wants to purchase, or a worker, magically appears in front of them for them to purchase, and then also, everything they decide to make will magically sell, basically. And this is all going to happen with all prices assumed to be as if supply and demand were in perpetual equilibrium, i.e. everything is going to buy and sell at its exact value. We're still working within the context of a naive labor theory of value. So I know this probably sounds kind of insane to make these kinds of assumptions, but I just want to make it very clear that these assumptions are not like the assumption of an initially high reserve army. The assumption of an initially high reserve army is like a logical necessity for capitalism. You can't not make this assumption. This is only for the sake of highlighting certain aspects of capitalism by holding certain things constant and kind of making if you make capitalism behaves nicely somewhere, then you can more clearly see where it's ill-behaved elsewhere, right? That's the idea here. So we'll bring these assumptions we're going to start with, but then we'll bring them back into the picture once we're done. So I just want to make that very, very clear. So with that all said, let's start things off. We hit the green button, accumulation begins. And so, of course, initially this only amounts to simple accumulation. The inventions and the centralization and the monopolies and the buyouts, those are all going to happen later. Initially, let's say we just have simple accumulation. And just for simplicity, let's assume for the moment that's the only type of accumulation that's occurring. And so to facilitate this analysis, we're going to use everything that we've talked about so far, but we're also going to bring in two new variables, and that is going to be the rate of capital accumulation and the demand for labor. So let's go ahead and define those things. So to keep the math simple, I'm going to completely ignore the departmental stuff that we were talking about in the previous video. We're not going to think at all about like a capital goods department or a wage goods department. We're just going to think about society as a whole. And of course, the reason that we can do that is because it's not necessary to do otherwise, because we're assuming, remember, that everything is working perfectly in circulation, right? So that includes any kind of disproportionality issues. We don't have them. We're not thinking about them. We're not worrying about them. It's not necessary to do otherwise. So I'm going to reuse similar notation though. So let y equal c plus v plus s. This is going to be the total value output of society at the beginning of the production period. Basically, to remember, every period society is left with a giant collection of commodities that it's created. If you take the total value of all those commodities, you get y. And then at the end of that period, then you're going to get a different y. You're going to get more stuff. They're producing more value on top of that. So then you get a new collection of commodities. Some of them get consumed in the process, and you end up with a new number here. At the end of that period, you end up with a new c and a new v and a new s, a c prime, a v prime, and an s prime. So these are our numbers, and this number here, C plus V, this is the amount of capital. Remember that we said the size of a capital in general is going to be like C plus V, where like C plus V is like if you take your money and then you spend it on means of production and labor power, then you know that what this is, what the total value of these two things combined is it's the total value investment that's required to kind of move along this capital process, to kind of create this production process and keep it going. And so the total kind of operating cost of a particular capital is C plus V, and you can kind of think of that as the size of the capital. This actually might make more sense if you think about it how a capitalist would think about it, which is that they would see C plus V as the actual capital, right? If they're seeing capital as a sum of money, then C plus V is the size of their investment, right? It's how much they invest in order to make their profit, if you're thinking about it in money terms. So, you know, that's probably like a better way to think about it. And so the C plus V here, that's just the total size of all of the capitals for the entire economy added up. And so you can kind of think about C plus V, this C plus V here, the one that I put right here. You should think about C plus V as the total capital accumulated by the beginning of the period. And likewise, you could think about C prime plus V prime as the total capital accumulated at the end of, by the end of the period. So what I'm interested in thinking about is the total capital that accumulates during this one period that I'm concerned with. And so the total capital so if C plus V is the total capital accumulated at the beginning of the period, and C prime plus V prime is the total capital accumulation by the end of the period, then the total accumulation that happens during that period is going to be C prime plus V prime minus C plus V. It's just the difference, right? This is the change in the C plus V. I'm going to call it that. Change in C plus V. That's how you read this delta thing. And that is the amount of capital accumulated during the period. So I'm just concerned with like a particular production period. And so for a particular production period, if I just take the total capital that you have at the end, the total capital that you have at the beginning, take the difference, that's the total capital accumulation during that period. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the rate of capital accumulation to be this amount of capital that's accumulated during the period as a proportion of what you had in the beginning of the period. In other words, what this basically is it's how much your economy is going to change as a proportion of what it was from period to period. You can kind of think of it as the percentage change in how much capital you're accumulating. So basically, if G is 1/2, then economy grows by 50% each period, or at least during at least if you're projecting the rate of accumulation forward, then if G is 1/2, then what you're saying is that every period you get an amount of capital that accumulates that is 50% of what you had before. In other words, your economy is basically growing by 50% each period. That's what the rate of capital accumulation gives you. You can kind of think of this as the percentage change in the size of the economy, measured in value terms. So we have the rate of capital accumulation. Now I want to define the demand for labor. And in order to do that, I'd like to ask the question, how much labor was employed in the previous period? So remember, we have some kind of particular production period in question that we're thinking about. And so we have a beginning, that is to say, the beginning of the production period we're thinking about is also the end of the previous production period. And so if I ask the question, like, how much labor was employed in the previous period, well, I have this total value output that I end up with at the end of the previous period. That is to say, y equals C plus V plus S. And if you look at these two numbers, we've said multiple times that, of these three numbers, this right here, this C amount, is dead labor. It's value of raw materials and means of production. And so, because it was, in other words, this is all labor that was done before that previous period. So the total living labor that was added on during that previous period, that's going to be this number here, V plus S. that's the labor employed during the previous period. It's the living labor. I've said this many times already, but it definitely bears repeating because it's definitely kind of confusing. And if you have, we've used this identity a lot. We have this number L that is just V plus S. And so this is the amount of labor employed in the previous period. So that's the answer. And then likewise, V prime plus S prime, that is to say L prime, is the labor employed during the current period. So we have L, that is the amount of labor employed in the previous production period, and L prime, the amount of labor employed in the current period. And so the change in the amount of labor that's employed from period to period is going to be the change in L, which is L prime minus L. This is the change in labor employed between periods. So I'm going to define the demand for labor to basically be the rate of change in how much labor is being employed from period to period. You can see kind of how similar this looks to how I define the rate of capital accumulation. The rate of capital accumulation is the percent change in capital that's accumulated between periods, whereas the demand for labor is the percent change in how much labor gets used from period to period. So just as before, if D is 1/2, then what that means is that you're going to be using 50% more labor in the next period than you were in the previous period. And likewise, if D is, let's say, negative 1/2, well, then that means that you're using only half the labor that you used in the previous period. And that has to mean something. What does that mean? That means that the labor force was cut in half, and a lot of people were laid off. And so this is a very kind of powerful number in its implications, especially if it goes negative. So just to kind of reiterate, if D is 1/2, then the labor force increases by 50% between periods, and the reserve army, of course, is going to drain appropriately, right? That doesn't necessarily mean the reserve army drains by 50%. The reserve army might be much bigger than the actual labor force, in which case the reserve army only kind of drains a little bit proportional to its own size, but it does drain. If you're increasing the size of the labor force, then that means you are draining out the reserve army, and the reserve army is shrinking. If D is negative 1/2, then you're firing half the workforce, and so the reserve army inflates. And so this number, this demand for labor here, has a lot of importance when we're considering what's going to happen to the reserve army. It's essentially the variable of interest if you want to think about the reserve army. And so this really is kind of the goal, is to think about this number here. So my primary interest right now is to compare the demand for labor, this number here, to this number here, the rate of capital accumulation. And the first thing to note is I want to actually kind of observe something mathematically that Marx claims in Volume 1. So I have a quote from him right here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I only want to read this part that I've highlighted here. He says, since the demand for labor is determined not by the amount of capital as a whole, but by its variable constituent alone, that demand falls progressively with the increase in the total capital instead of, as previously assumed, rising in proportion to it. He's a little ahead of us here. He's talking about a change in the composition of capital, which is something we haven't introduced yet. I'm really only interested in this first part of the sentence. Since the demand for labor is determined not by the amount of capital, but by its variable constituent alone. What does Marx mean by that? Let's see for ourselves. We don't see a V part here, this D equals delta L over L. He's claiming that this D number only depends on V, whereas this G number depends on C plus V. And that's a little, that's kind of clear, but not as clear as we can make it. So to make that extremely clear and to make it kind of startling how right Marx is about this math sometimes without actually doing any of it, let's note that L is equal to V plus S, and we've done this many times already, but we know that the rate of exploitation E is equal to S over V, and so S is equal to E times V, and so if I plug that in up here, what I get is that this is V plus E times V, which is 1 plus E times V. And so L is equal to 1 plus E times V. And this E, let's assume it isn't changing, just to kind of make this math clear. It is changing, but just kind of bear with me for a second. So then D is equal to L prime minus L over L, right? That's the change in L is L prime minus L. And so that's going to be 1 plus E times V prime minus 1 plus E times V over 1 plus E times V. And so if I factor out 1 plus E from all these terms, I get that this is 1 plus E times V prime minus V over 1 plus E times V. And so these 1 plus E's cancel out, and I'm left with V prime minus V over V, otherwise known as delta V over V. And so we have that we defined D in terms of this total amount of living labor L, but if you kind of consider that the rate of exploitation is constant, then what you get is that the demand for labor is also just the change in the variable capital over the variable capital in the beginning of the period. Whereas compare that to G, that's the change in C plus V over C plus V. And you can see just how right Marx is when he says that. You know, since the demand for labor is determined not by the amount of capital as a whole, but by its variable constituent alone. That is the only difference between the demand for labor and the rate of capital accumulation, is that the rate of capital accumulation includes this C term here, and the demand for labor does not. That's the only difference. And so that's kind of amazing. Maybe not amazing, it's kind of obvious, but it's also kind of it's always kind of surprising to me how right Marx is about some of the claims that he makes, especially in this chapter. Now, as impressive as this is, with regards to Marx's ability to kind of navigate this math without actually doing it, it is also a testament to the fact that you really do need to do this math, because there is an implicit claim that's being made here without Marx saying it as such. Because in order to cancel out these 1 plus E's, you had to assume that the rate of exploitation is not changing from one period to another. Otherwise, you can't do this cancellation. And so I'm going to generally stick to using this equation for D, but in doing so, I'm also going to have to periodically kind of back up and kind of reconsider what is different about the observations we're making in the case where E is changing. So to start doing that now, let's kind of think about if I didn't have that E was constant over time, then what do we have really? I have that D is equal to basically 1 plus E prime, I'll have to say, right? E prime is equal to the new E. If the exploitation rate is changing between periods, then this is the new one, and then this is the old one. Let's see what happens when we deal with that. So I have 1 plus E times V prime, that's going to be L prime, minus 1 plus E times V divided by 1 plus E times V. So basically what we have here is that if the rate of exploitation is increasing from one period to another, then to pretend that this is E is to basically pretend that this number is smaller than it actually is. And so what that means is that the D we have here, this equation that we wrote down for D, is an approximation of D, which is actually a little bit under what it should be. It's a little bit less than what it should be. And if this E is actually shrinking, if E is falling between periods, then this equation for D is an approximation of D that is a little bit over what it should be. And that makes sense because, right, if the rate of exploitation is increasing, then that should have a positive effect on the demand for labor. That should have an effect of offsetting a falling demand for labor if E is rising, and it also should make the demand for labor worse if E is falling over time. That is to say, the workers are getting more wages. So the lower wages are, the higher the demand is going to be for labor. So this is just kind of one thing that we'll sort of have to keep doing as we go. We're going to come up with a few different equations for the demand for labor, and each time we come up with a new equation for the demand for labor, we'll have to kind of reconsider this thing we're doing in order to simplify the math a little bit and make sure that we're coming to sound conclusions about it. So that's one kind of step. The next thing I want to show is that this rate of capital accumulation here, despite it looking quite different than anything we've kind of looked at mathematically so far, is actually very similar. It's actually pretty much the same thing as a variable that we're already very familiar with, maybe more familiar with than any other. And to make that observation, what we have to assume is we have to bring in an assumption we made earlier, which is that we're assuming that the capitalists are basically taking a fixed proportion of their surplus value each period and reinvesting it. Now, to say that they're reinvesting a fixed proportion, and that number, by the way, is A. We've been denoting it A. Is to say that that's the amount that's accumulated. So, in other words, i.e., the change in the, this is the total capital accumulated. we're saying that this number is equal to A times the surplus value of the previous period, right? I mean, we have that y is equal to c plus v plus s. This is the total surplus value in the beginning of at the beginning of the period. That's the amount that we're reinvesting. We're reinvesting A of it. And so what we have is that the total capital accumulated is going to be the total capital reinvested. That's what we're really saying here. Total value reinvested. So we're gonna, if we're reinvesting A of the surplus value each period, then we have this identity. And when you plug that in, then we get that G is equal to, well, it's A times S now. And would you look at that? What's this number right here? A over S, A times S over C plus V. What is this? This is A times pi. This is the rate of profit. So basically, the rate of accumulation is just the rate of profit times A. If you take the proportion, the rate of reinvestment, the amount of surplus value that the proportion of the surplus value that's being reinvested each period, then the rate of accumulation is just that reinvestment proportion times the rate of profit. So G is equal to A times the rate of profit. Now, there's a lot I could say about this relationship, but we're going to save it until we have all the nice ingredients that we need to make our points. So let's just put this identity in our pockets for now. We know now that the rate of accumulation is actually something we're more familiar with than we realized. So that's a small observation, but it's important. The next thing I want to do is I want to derive an explicit relationship between D and G. We have that they're clearly very similar. What I want to come up with is an explicit equation that relates the two. I want to be able to say that something involving D equals something involving G. And the way to do that is, it's a little bit of work, but it's not that hard. So G, let's first start with G. G is equal to the change in C plus V over C plus V. We can write that as C prime plus V prime minus C plus V over C plus V. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this fraction. So this is equal to C prime plus V prime over C plus V minus C plus V over C plus V, and that's just 1. And so if I add, so I have that G is actually equal to C prime plus V prime divided by C plus V minus 1, and I'm going to add that 1 over to the other side, and what that gives me is that G plus 1 is equal to C prime plus V prime over C plus V. So that's going to be useful. Now we also have that D is equal to the change in V over V, and if I rewrite that as V prime minus V over V, then I can do the exact same thing I just did with the G. I can say that this is V prime over V minus 1, and then if I add that 1 over, I have that D plus 1 is equal to V prime over V. Now I'm going to do the crazy step. It's not that crazy, but it's going to look a little weird. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the classic math trick where you multiply both sides by 1 and then replace the 1 with something silly. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 1, and if I'm multiplying both sides by 1, then I don't even have to write it over here, and I'm going to write it over here, but I'm going to, instead of writing 1, I'm going to write C prime plus V prime over C prime plus V prime. Just going to multiply by 1, and then I'm going to multiply by 1 again. I'm going to multiply by C plus V over C plus V. And so what I'm doing is I'm basically multiplying both sides of this equation by 1 twice. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to rearrange the terms. So first of all, I'm going to write as the first fraction, I'm going to take this guy and this guy. I'm going to put them first. So this is C plus V over V. So that's these two terms. Times, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, but with V prime here and this C prime plus V prime. So I'm going to write this as times V prime over C prime plus V prime, and then I only have 2 terms remaining, so that's equal to C prime plus V prime over C plus V. So I haven't done anything, I've just rearranged the terms, and now we stare at it. And you'll notice immediately that this number here, C prime plus V prime over C plus V, that's just G plus 1. So that's just G plus 1. And so I can plug in G now for this. We only have to kind of look at these two terms now. Now, C plus V over V, maybe I'll kind of write some stuff over here. C plus V over V, if I break up this fraction, I have that this is C over V plus 1, for the same reasons as before. And what's C over V? This is the composition of capital at the beginning of the period. This is K. So C plus V over V, that's equal to K plus 1, where K is the composition of capital at the beginning of the period. For the exact same reason, V prime over C prime plus V prime, this is equal to 1 over C prime plus V prime over V prime, if I just kind of write it like that. And that's equal to, for the same reason as this is equal to 1 over K prime plus 1, where K prime is equal to C prime over V prime. This is the composition of capital at the end of the period. So K is the composition of capital at the beginning of the period. K prime is the composition of capital at the end of the period. And so I have that this term here is just K plus 1, and then this here term here is K prime plus 1. And so I have that D plus 1 is equal to K plus 1, that's this, times K times 1 over K prime plus 1, that's this, times G plus 1. And so when I clean it up, I end up with the very striking equation that D plus 1 is equal to the composition of capital plus 1 in the beginning of the period, divided by the composition of capital plus 1 at the end of the period, times the rate of accumulation plus 1. This kind of looks complicated, but it says a lot on its own. So there's a lot we're going to say about this equation, but there's one thing that I want to observe immediately. The first thing that we can observe with using this equation is Marx's famous adage that accumulation of capital is increase in the proletariat, assuming that the only accumulation you have is simple accumulation. So if the composition of capital is not changing, if simple accumulation is the only thing that's going on, then that's really saying that K is equal to K prime. And if K is equal to K prime, then K plus 1 over K prime plus 1 is just equal to 1, because this is the same number. And so D plus 1 is equal to just 1 times G plus 1. And so, that's a stupid thing to write. Just don't write the times 1 at all. And then at that point, we have the D plus 1 equals G plus 1, and then the 1's cancel out. And so you just have that D equals G. And so that's, again, I'm always kind of amazed by how well Marx's claims work out mathematically when you actually kind of write them out. What this says is that accumulation of capital is increase in the proletariat. The famous adage holds up. The rate of increase in the demand for labor is equal. It's exactly the same as the rate of accumulation. There is no difference between the two. This, in other words, this difference, we said that these are the same thing except for G includes the C stuff and D doesn't. Well, it turns out that if the ratio of C over V is unchanging, then that C stuff that's here does not matter. Then it might as well not be there. D equals G if the ratio of C to V is not changing. And so accumulation of capital is increasing the proletariat. To the extent that K is not changing, one cannot rise without the other rising. One cannot stay positive without the other staying positive. So that's one cool thing to observe. But this is more than just a cool observation. Observing this relationship is going to bridge us into the rest of these videos and really transition us into a full-on discussion of the general law of capital accumulation. And that all begins with observing that, well, we're assuming perfect market conditions, right? This means that the capitalists are just going to be able to keep accumulating without any kind of problems. They're just going to keep doing it. And so this number here is never going to go negative. And what we're really what we see here, since K and K prime are obviously both positive, what this means is that as long as the rate of accumulation stays positive, the demand for labor also stays positive, and meaning that the reserve army will never inflate. it will just continue to drain and drain and drain. And if so, the reserve army is going to disappear over time. And as the reserve army disappears over time, the bargaining power of the workers is going to gradually increase. And the workers are going to find themselves with more and more bargaining power. And they're going to be able to negotiate better and better wages. And so their lives are going to get better and better. And so an apologist for capitalism might look at this and say to us, your own logic screws you over here. Just take out technological change. As long as the workers fight for like political regulations on like technological change, then the reserve army will drain, and the workers will eventually be able to share in the wealth of the capitalists. In other words, it looks like what we're showing here is that trickle-down economics is true in this case. That the workers do get to share in the wealth. That you should just want to that the capitalists, they're going up to the workers right now and saying, just deal with being miserable for a while and your lives will get better, right? That's the trickle-down economics argument. We're showing that that's true here almost, it looks like. If there's no technological change happening, if there's no reorganization of labor happening, if there's no monopoly formation, now obviously those things are going to be there, but nonetheless, we need to address this apparent concern. Why isn't it going to be the case that the workers share in the wealth of the capitalists as capital accumulates? And the reason why is because remember what we said earlier about G. It's equal to A times pi. G is actually just A times the rate of profit. It's the rate of reinvestment times the rate of profit. So what we're saying there is that as the reserve army drains, the workers gain power, bargaining power. Let me just write this down. So as the reserve army drains, the workers are going to gain bargaining power, and the rate of exploitation is going to begin to decrease as their wages get bigger, right? But what is pi? Pi, we have our evil equation for pi. That's equal to the rate of exploitation divided by k plus 1. Now k plus 1 is constant. It's not changing at all. And so since k is constant, as E is decreasing, the rate of profit is going to decrease. So sure, okay, it seems like workers are sharing in the wealth of the capitalists as capital accumulates, but also they're accumulating at a slower and slower rate. And here's the thing about this. A here, the rate of reinvestment, think about it. What did we say happens as the rate of profit decreases? As the rate of profit decreases, capitalists become more and more disincentivized to reinvest, meaning that A is going to fall. So let me write that down. Now that's kind of interesting because the rate of accumulation is actually not just the rate of profit. It's the rate of profit times the rate of reinvestment. So what we're saying here is that any fall in the rate of profit has an amplified effect on the rate of accumulation. But what's the rate of accumulation? It's the rate of demand for labor. And so any fall in the rate of profit has an amplified effect on the demand for labor. On the demand for labor. If the rate of profit falls a little bit, then the demand for labor is going to fall a lot, because D is equal to A times pi. So D falls a lot compared to pi. You're likely to get a pretty immediate, major slowdown in the rate at which the reserve army is draining, the rate of new hires. And so the workers are likely going to start to sweat a little bit at this point. Maybe demanding these things isn't a great idea. Meanwhile, what's more important here is that what did we say in the fourth part, what capitalists are going to do as the rate of profit falls? They're going to try to crank up the rate of exploitation. Meanwhile, capitalists will go on the offensive in attempts to raise E. And so what do we actually get? What do we get instead of trickle-down economics? We get class struggle. We have a stare-down between the workers and the capitalists. It's not clear what happens at that point. Well, okay, it wouldn't be clear if it wasn't already clear who has the political power in a capitalist system. To quote Marx in this section, he says, Adam Smith has already shown that in such a conflict, taken on the whole, the master is always master, which I think is fairly convincing. I don't know about you. When it gets to this point, when this class struggle ensues, the composition of political power determines how this turns out. And in a capitalist society, I hate to break it to all of you, but the capitalists are in power. And so on the whole, they're going to win this. And so in his estimate, what this means when you reach this point of class struggle is the capitalists win and the workers lose, and they find, the rate of exploitation cranks back down, and the rate of profit goes back up, and then the process repeats. And what you basically get at that point is a picture that looks like this. I'm going to graph wages over time and rate of profit over time. And I'm going to make the wages red and the rate of profit blue. So the wages are going to start to, so basically what we said was going to happen is that the rate of profit is going to fall a little bit. The wages are going to rise a little bit. So let's not put them at the same point. Let's say the wages are going to rise a little bit, the rate of profit falls a little bit. Eventually the wages get too big, and they don't necessarily have to cross like this, but one's going to be getting smaller and the other is going to be getting bigger. And then eventually this becomes a problem, a class struggle ensues, and in Marx's rendition of this, the capitalists win. So at that point, they manage to crank up the rate of exploitation, and by cranking up the rate of exploitation, they crank the rate of profit back up. And conversely, we have that the wages are going to begin to fall again, and then you're going to get back to the situation you were at before. And then what happens? Then the same situation repeats itself. And so you just get this back and forth. You get the wages going up and down as the rate of profit goes down and up. And so as long as the capitalists stay in power, you get this is actually, it's not supposed to be going up like this. It's supposed to be going straight. I didn't draw it right. It doesn't change. It doesn't go up or down. It just stays kind of bounded between two numbers. So nothing, in other words, Joe Biden is correct. Nothing fundamentally changes. Right, the workers will find their lives getting a little better, and then a little worse, and then a little better, and then a little worse. And the capitalists will perceive a second business cycle, if you will, right? They will perceive the rate of profit going up, and then down, and then up, and then down, but it's no concern. It's not going to change in any significant way. And neither will the wages. And so trickle-down economics, as long as the capitalists have the political power, is a bunch of garbage. It's a bunch of nonsense. One other thing about this argument, by the way, is that it also explains how the law of value asserts itself over the value of labor power. Let's say that I lower the value of labor power through technological change. I know I'm not talking about that yet, but suppose I do that. I implement some new technology that shrinks the amount of time it takes to make, cheap clothing for workers, right? That lowers the value of labor power, but the wages don't immediately change. And so this actually shows us how the law of value asserts itself and eventually brings about a change in those wages. It's through this class struggle, because if the workers' wages don't change after that cheapening of the price, then real wages effectively have gone up. If the workers are getting the same amount of money, then they can use it to buy more stuff suddenly because the clothes are cheaper, right? And so, but that's going to cut into the rate of profit, and so and then this mechanism kicks in. And then wages adjust. And then the capitalists win that class struggle, and then actual wages are brought back down in line with real wages, and that's just a built-in mechanism for an example of how the law of value acts on society and asserts itself. Now, with all that said, there's a couple loose ends here. There's kind of a small loose end and then a really big loose end that you might have identified already that's going to transition us into the rest of these videos. We'll start with the small loose end. So the small loose end is that all of what I just did is assuming that the equation for D, that it's delta V over V, which again assumes that the rate of exploitation is constant. So let's quickly kind of think about what's different about this equation when the rate of exploitation is not constant. And it's actually kind of neat what happens. So to see that, basically what you get, so basically what changes is if we start here, this is where we actually use the equation that it's delta V over V. If alternatively, if you're not assuming that E is constant, you have that this is 1 plus E prime times V prime minus 1 plus E times V over v, 1 plus e times v. And so this is what we have instead of this right here. And then we can still kind of write something like this, but we have to keep the 1 plus e. So what you end up with is you do have the minus 1, because these two terms are identical. But then what you have is 1 plus e prime times v prime divided by 1 plus e times v minus 1. So that's what you get instead. And so basically what I do next is I add the 1 over, and I say d plus 1 is equal to v prime over v, and then I multiply by 1 twice here. But what I have instead at that point is that d plus 1, instead of equaling v prime over v, it actually now equals 1 plus e prime over 1 plus e times v prime over v. But then I can do the exact same stuff. You just multiply by these two terms, and then you do the exact same rearranging, and then what you end up with, and as you do that rearranging, you just keep this 1 plus e prime over 1 plus e, you just carry it all the way down, and just do nothing differently with it. You just kind of do the exact same steps I do here, except just have this term lying outside of it the whole time. And what you end up with instead of this is that d plus 1 is equal to 1 plus e prime over 1 plus e times k plus 1 over k prime plus 1 times g plus 1. So you end up with the exact same equation, but with this ratio of 1 plus e prime over 1 plus e. The ratio of, basically it's kind of interesting, because d basically ends up being the new e over the old e times the old k over the new k times the rate of accumulation. And that's significant because it kind of says something similar about exploitation as it does about the composition of capital. What we have with this fraction here, k plus 1 over k prime plus 1, is the statement that as k prime, as the composition of capital gets bigger, d is going to get smaller because this number ends up being less than 1. We're kind of saying the same thing about the rate of exploitation. As the rate of exploitation gets bigger, this numerator gets bigger, and so d gets bigger. So basically what we're saying here is that d works exactly how we said it worked, except also if e is changing, then an increase in e actually boosts d, and a decrease in e shrinks d, which makes a lot of sense. And that's interesting because if we consider this equation in terms of the argument we just gave about simple accumulation and trickle-down economics being a bunch of garbage, it just actually makes this argument more forceful. It doesn't actually hurt it at all. In fact, it amplifies it. Because the big observation here is that as the rate of exploitation decreases, the rate of profit decreases, and the demand for labor decreases a lot compared to the rate of profit. Well, if the rate of exploitation is decreasing, well, then this number is less than 1. And so what I get is just an even more dramatic fall in the demand for labor. So really, a falling rate of exploitation means an even more dramatic fall in D than what we said originally. So that was just worth noting. We basically have this more general equation for D if we're considering that the rate of exploitation might be changing from period to period. So that was the small loose end. Now let's move on to the big loose end. The big loose end is that we have to note that nothing is fundamentally changing with respect to the wages or to the profit rate. Nonetheless, capital is continuing to accumulate, and the reserve army is continuing to drain. Now, if the reserve army is continuing to shrink, because the capitalists are simply just like telling the workers, you're going to get less wages and deal with it because we have the power here, then that becomes an increasingly untenable political situation. As the reserve army dwindles towards zero, like capitalists can't just keep winning this over and over again, or they can't keep winning this by just pushing down wages, because if all you're doing is pushing back down wages, then you're not actually addressing the reason why the wages were going up in the first place, which is that the workers were gaining bargaining power from the shrinking reserve army. At some point, the capitalists are going to have to address this problem not just by driving down wages, but by actually addressing where this rise in economic power of the working class is coming from. They have to reinflate the reserve army somehow. They have to take away that economic advantage that the workers are gaining. At some point, just cutting wages isn't going to work anymore. They're going to have to find a way to take away that economic advantage. They have to find a way to reinflate the reserve army. And so at this point, we need to ask the question, What are the options? What can the capitalists do to win this class struggle? It's one thing to say that they're going to win this class struggle because they have the political power, but they have a set of options here in order to do that. You have to reinflate the reserve army. Well, how do you do it? Well, there's 3 ways to do it because there's 3 different groupings within the reserve army. Which of those populations are you going to target? Are you going to target the stagnant population? Are you going to target the latent population? Or are you going to target the floating population? Let's think about each one of those. Let's start with the stagnant population. To increase the stagnant population is actually sort of related to driving down wages, because when you drive down wages, you aren't doing it uniformly. The people with the best jobs have those jobs because they have, skill sets or a history of gaining some kind of power. They have more power than the people with the worst jobs. And so they're going to be the last ones to be targeted by an overall drop in wages. They're going to be the last ones to be affected by this kind of a class struggle. The first jobs to have their wages cut are going to be the worst jobs, the ones that are the most throwaway jobs. And so what you're going to have is life getting worse for the people at the fringes. And so in some sense, this has to correspond to like a conversion of some of the bad jobs or the mediocre jobs or the just decent jobs into jobs which would place you on the fringes of society. That's the stagnant part of the reserve army is like the fringes of the labor itself. It's like I'm actually going to link in the description a video by the Gravel Institute on Uber. I think that's a really important video to watch to understand the stagnant population, and also to understand like this conversion that I'm talking about from of decent jobs into stagnant population jobs. The conversion, like the assault on taxi drivers that kind of destroyed or is in the process of destroying the taxi industry and replacing it with this gig work industry. What you're really doing there is you're taking you're taking the taxi driving industry and you're qualitatively changing it, and through those qualitative changes, like pauperizing the industry. You're making it so that it is barely livable now. And in that sense, you are increasing the stagnant population because you're turning those workers into stagnant workers. So that's one answer, is that you expand the reserve army via targeting the stagnant population. What I mean by that is taking something like cab driving, decent profession, and pauperizing it, basically. Like, that's one way to expand the ranks of the reserve army, and to some extent that's always going to be going alongside any generally observable drop in wages in the population. So that's what it means to increase the ranks of the stagnant part of the reserve army. Now let's think about what it means to increase the ranks of the latent part of the reserve army. To increase the latent part of the reserve army, what does that mean? It means to import labor from somewhere else, and that's exactly what happened in France and Germany and Sweden. The Nordic states, I think, imported a lot of labor from Yugoslavia while it was collapsing. The peasants of Mexico. The latent part of the reserve army, that is one of these fights. And so, that's another way to do it. That's another way to bring up the rate of exploitation that can be used instead of or in addition to lowering wages or increasing the ranks of the stagnant population. And then finally, there's a third way. And that third way is to increase the floating part of the reserve army. And so how do you increase the floating part of the reserve army? You can't just fire a bunch of workers. You need that labor. You have to replace that labor with something. And the way to do that is to implement labor-saving technology. If you implement labor-saving technology, then you can fire a chunk of the workforce, because you don't need a chunk of the workforce anymore to do the same stuff that you've been doing. And what's noteworthy here is that this method of increasing the size of the reserve army, technological change, this is already something that the capitalists are going to be doing, right? They're not doing it in the model that we started with here because we're focusing only on simple accumulation, but this is one of the characteristic kind of features of accumulation, one of the 3 that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. They were already going to be doing this. And so now we're really coming towards the general law of capital accumulation. So what we have basically here is like a second falling rate of profit argument. But at the very least, what we're noticing is a process happening in capitalism that is going to be another reason that the rate of profit will fall unless something is done about it. We have that as accumulation continues, the reserve army is going to drain, and as it drains, the workers are going to be gaining bargaining power, and wages are going to be rising. And that's going to lead to a fall in the rate of exploitation and a corresponding fall in the rate of profit. And we noted that that's eventually going to create a class struggle between the workers and the capitalists. And so in order for the capitalists to win this class struggle, they have to find a way to reinflate the reserve army. And so what we've noted here is that one of the ways of reinflating the reserve army, one of the main three ways to do it, is to increase the floating population. And the way that you do that is you implement labor-saving technology. And this particular way of reinflating the reserve army is noteworthy because the capitalists were already going to be doing it. This was already a method of accumulation. This was part of the general process of capital accumulation already. And so what we have to do next is we have to ask, how powerful is this method of technological change at reinflating the reserve army? How powerful is it as a method of making this reserve army get bigger over time? Because if it turns out that this method of reinflating the reserve army is more powerful than the rate at which the reserve army is going to drain due to simple accumulation, then this class struggle might kind of, from the perspective of the capitalists, might sort of resolve itself. The capitalists might not even have to do anything beyond what they were already going to be doing. And in fact, depending on how powerful this really is, they might even find themselves in a better position than they were before this class struggle began. If this method of technological change is really, really, really powerful, then they might end up with a higher rate of exploitation than they did before. And so in the next video, we're going to pick up that question and really think hard about it. We're going to construct several different models under several different sets of assumptions of capitalist systems kind of naturally accumulating, and have these two processes sort of stack up against each other, and we're going to see what the outcome is in every case. That is to say, we're going to kind of come up with model capitalist societies in which simple accumulation and technological dynamism are happening simultaneously, and we're just going to kind of inspect the long-term tendency. Which one wins out? Does the simple accumulation win out and we end up with a shrinking reserve army? Or does the technological dynamism win out and we end up with an expanding reserve army? So, I'm going to be constructing models that kind of point out long-term tendencies in a capitalist system under certain assumptions. And in that sense, we will be identifying like trends that are foundational kind of tendencies of any capitalist system. And that's important on its own right. But I think it's equally important, if not more important, to kind of keep this more general framing in our heads. And basically be asking the question, as we look at these long-term trends, and as we look at these kind of foundational tendencies to the capitalist system, we should be asking ourselves the question, what is the character of capital accumulation? We have this process, this kind of complex process of capital accumulation, and what's it about? What is it always going to look like? What are some general things that I can say about it that are always true? What is capitalist accumulation really all about? That's kind of the real question I think that I would like people to keep in their heads. And we've already identified that to some extent it's going to be about this class struggle. Accumulation requires the reserve army to drain, and to the extent that the reserve army is draining, we're going to have this conflict between the workers and the capitalists. And we have to ask the question, what are the tools at the capitalist's disposal that they can use to wage this class struggle? Because by viewing and evaluating those tools, that's how we get a sense of what capital accumulation is all about. So in the next video, we'll start to build these models and we'll start to observe these long-term tendencies.